Okay, so this is going to be a video about me critiquing Dan's response, who was critiquing my response, who I was critiquing his response. Anyway, it's 51 minutes long. So to make this easier, I'm going to just cut off the segments that are related to what Dan said specifically to me, addressing my arguments, and I'll respond to that to make it easy for you. If you want more context, just check out the full video below for Dan's video. It's got the whole thing there. So let's get into it.
It may not be ad hominem, but according to Mike Jones, who is obviously the authority on all things fallacious, it is poisoning the well.
Dan's right. It is poisoning well. Dan, I apologize for that. Should have just stuck to the original argument, but I don't film these like I'm doing this video now in segments where I can address every specific point specifically. Sometimes my frustration comes out, but I apologize for that. Should have just stuck with the argument, and let's get on with the video.
So a few problems here. To begin, I can find less than half a dozen cases of women claiming to have been raped in prison by trans women. And one of the cases that I found, the first one that I investigated more fully, was a case that was brought in 2019 by Jane Doe against the Illinois Department of Corrections, claiming that they transferred a trans woman into her facility and then that trans woman raped her. And the Illinois Department of Corrections investigated and determined that it was consensual sex. And so this lawsuit was then filed, which was then dismissed with prejudice by the courts in 2022. And the other examples that I looked up were examples of people who only claimed to be trans after they were accused of these crimes, and this brings up some other issues. For instance, trans women are far more likely to be the victim of sexual violence in prison than are cis women at the hands of trans women. Additionally, both cis women and trans women are far more likely to be the victims of sexual violence at the hands of correctional facility officers and staff than they are by other trans women. And when it comes to folks who claim to be trans only so that can facilitate sexual assault and sexual violence, that's not the fault of trans women. That's cis men trying to exploit their identification as trans women in order to gain access to opportunities for sexual violence. So if we're comparing the vulnerability of people here, there's no comparison. Trans folks are far more vulnerable, not just to sexual violence within prisons, but also just in general. They are discriminated against economically. They are far more likely to be the victims of sexual violence as well as physical assaults and homicide. They are going to be discriminated against in the workplace. They are going to be discriminated against in so many different ways as a result of the stigma that comes with transphobia. And pointing to a handful of occurrences you can count on one hand as overruling all of the other threats to trans folks, and particularly trans women, is profoundly inaccurate and misguided and bigoted.
Okay, there's a lot here. So I want to get this right. You only found a handful of cases that claimed that women were raped by transgender women or females. You investigated one particular case that turned out to be that the allegations were dismissed. And then you, in this particular segment, contributed quite a lot of time in how your utilitarian ethical model justifies that even if it was happening, there's far more harm being done to trans women, therefore it is okay if it is actually happening. And I'm not misrepresenting you there. Let's take a look at this, right? You only picked a handful of cases. I don't think that's fair for you to just investigate one and say that it's not the case. You kind of poison the well there, so to speak, with regards to, well, maybe it's somewhat of a red herring, where you're trying to drift the audience off to say that out of the handful of cases that you looked at that claimed that this has happened, you picked the one whereby it turned out to be a fraudulent claim. And therefore, it kind of infers that it's not really happening. And that's disingenuous and that's insincere what you're doing there. And then you go into the utilitarian ethical model, which I'll address shortly. But here's an example, right? If we look at the famous Karen White 7 years ago, I mean, this man, raped pregnant women, drugged them and raped them. He's a horrible human being. And then when he was remanded in prison, claimed to be transgender, and he sexually assaulted women in that women's correctional facility. He then gets convicted in jail. You know, he did rape those women. He did assault those women in the female prison. And then what transpired is, since then, it became an issue in the UK courts, and they had to address it in Parliament. But this person is convicted, still in prison, still claiming to be a woman, even if they later said, "Oh, I'm really a man, I only did to exploit the system," and they're not truly transgender. It doesn't actually negate the initial argument that people that claimed to support this ideology and claim to be women, that the system, because of the ideology that you promote, that it is actually real and true, that it's not governed by biology, that it's a societal construct that is fluid, that you can change whenever you please. It's enabled this person here to cause harm. And my argument is that it was unnecessary. It could have been avoided. If people like you didn't advocate for this ideology, that these people would be treated as mentally ill people and should go to a psych ward. They should be treated for gender dysphoria the way it used to be. This could have easily been avoided. This person is just one case that I found. You couldn't obviously look that hard enough, where this person was convicted, did assault people while remanded in prison, being transgender, still transgender today, and is a horrible human being. Now, with regards to what you did about the utilitarian ethical model that you employ as a secular humanist, ultimately, you haven't identified as such, but you use a lot of their arguments and their moral standard. My morality is not governed by if the consequences of a decision of good decisions, outweigh the bad consequences. Therefore, it's a good decision to make. Because that's what essentially you just said. You just said that the harm that is caused to trans women is far greater than the biological females that have suffered rape by this ideology that is happening, as demonstrated in just one case, and there's numerous, that you selectively picked the one that turned out to be a fraudulent claim or dismissed in court. I think that was somewhat opportunistic of you to do that, to suit your argument. But essentially, this ideology is occurring, and your justification is that if trans women suffer more harm, then we should allow this to occur. Do you really want to admit that? Do you want to admit that, okay, it is occurring, but because there's more harm to them, trans women, we should allow trans women to go in female prisons? I would like you, for the sake of this video and the sake of these claims, do you support trans women going into female prisons now that you know that this actually has occurred? I'd love to know what your take is on that. In regards to utilitarianism, I don't, that's not my moral standard. I think moral morality is transcendent, and we shouldn't govern things based on a utilitarian model because it's failed. Who gets to decide what the good and bad consequences are, and how do you actually analyze all the consequences? You can't account for all of them. It's a failed model employed during COVID, employed by governments, employed by yourself, and it's not a justification to allow trans women to be in female prisons and to allow this to occur when it is occurring. It's wrong, it's easily avoided. These people are mentally ill and should be treated as such.
Well, you have claims that happened, just like you have claims that trans folks were discriminated against when it comes to scholarships and even to admissions into higher education. So again, what we have is the highlighting and the centering of a few scattered instances of unverified claims over and against the easily quantifiable and demonstrable harm that happens to trans folks every single day. If we're comparing harm, there is simply no comparison. Transphobia causes significantly more harm than does the trans ideology.
Again, I think this boils down to the point where there is harm happening to trans women, trans men, trans people. There is harm happening. But it's not a justification to say that the harm that is caused to biological women is justified because there's more harm happening for trans women. The harm that is caused to trans women could be easily mitigated if we did not tolerate these ideologies, that we did not affirm them. We can still accept trans people that identify as such, but they need help. They need psychological, emotional help from professionals, from loving communities. I'm all for that. But to affirm this is to endorse a reality that is not true. It's living a lie. I brought this up with you that this in previous videos, which I can show a snippet of here shortly, that if gender is a societal construct, surely race and age is. And I remember your response to it. Here's the video.
Conceptual foundations, and that's just wildly inaccurate. Social constructs develop in their own ways, and they have to be interrogated on their own terms. And the features that have accreted around the cognitive exemplar of the notion of gender are very, very different, are a lot more fluid and a lot less bounded than the features that have accreted around the cognitive exemplar of the social construct of race. One is a lot more binary than the other, and one is a lot more fluid than the other. And if you'd like more information on how all of this works, I would highly recommend looking into cognitive linguistics. There are a bunch of wonderful intros out there, but I would recommend focusing on things like prototype theory and frame semantics, and Taylor's book, Linguistic Categorization, would be a wonderful place to start.
And ultimately, the response that you gave using complex words and somewhat of a rhetorical deflection is that whatever cognitive exemplar that is used to demonstrate, gender as a societal construct differs from that as race, because one being more fluid and one being more binary. Ultimately, you know what that answer represented? You didn't give any data. You didn't tell us what specific details actually separate and distinguish the race and gender. You just basically said it's different. And this is the thing. I encourage you to do debates on this so people can see you live, negotiate these ideas without having to prepare these long-winded responses, so people can quickly come back at you and be like, what are the specifics that you're talking about? What are the specifics that differentiate race and gender? And let's analyze that and see if that's true, because the chaos that can ensue if we allow people to change race, allow people to change age, will be far more disastrous than what we're even seeing now between gender. But it does open up the door. So with regards to, again, the utilitarian model, I'm not governed by that. We could easily avoid the harm with trans women and trans men if we lovingly treat the condition for what it is. It's a mental illness.
It's not a question of authority. I have never claimed to be an authority on this. I am sharing the data as I am aware of them, and I very clearly have a much firmer grasp on the data when it comes to misogyny as well as transphobia than you do.
Well, Dan, you didn't really present any data. You're regurgitating the data that we haven't seen in the video response. But ultimately, it'll be interesting to see what data you're using to support these arguments. But ultimately, I think that I still want you to answer the question that even if trans women, the harm against trans women and trans men outweighs the harm caused to biological females, specifically in the argument against that are in prison, does that justify it? I mean, I still pose the initial question to you. Are you okay with knowing that there is cases that exist of females being raped in prison? Are you okay to endorse the idea that trans women should go to a female prison? It'd be great to see your answer to that question.
So this is false. I have never presented myself that way. I have always acknowledged that it is impossible to rid oneself of their biases and their dogmas. The best we can hope to do is identify them in our work and then try to mitigate their influence. And in fact, I've even consistently acknowledged that there is a dogma that I bring into my work, and I've even put that in print. I've pointed out that when all other things are equal, and every time I say this, I always point out that's an important caveat that people always tend to ignore. When all other things are equal, I will give the benefit of the doubt to the less powerful group. The alternative to that is not objectivity or to be unbiased. The alternative is, when all other things are equal, to give the benefit of the doubt to the more powerful group. I'm talking about situations where we do not have data that determine which way we should go. I'm talking about instances where we have to choose arbitrarily one way or the other, and I will always give the benefit of the doubt in those circumstances to the less powerful group. Now, this does not mean that I am always perfect at this. This is also something that I have consistently and repeatedly pointed out. I'm not perfect. I'm going to make mistakes. I am happy to have those mistakes pointed out to me. It's one thing to say, hey, Dan, I see a bias here, and then actually demonstrating it. It's quite another entirely to say, Dan pretends he is unbiased, therefore I'm right. You have not identified any biases here. You've claimed, or you're going to claim anyway, that I am a victim of left-wing identity politics, but you can't demonstrate that. You can only claim it and then retreat to a bunch of right-wing authoritarian identity markers and wave them around in the hopes that your supporters who agree with those identity markers will rally around you, give you the little digital pats on the butt that make this all worth it, and then you can feel confident that I have been debunked and refuted. But as we're going to see, you can't defend those right-wing authoritarian identity markers that you're waving around. You're just asserting things based on nothing other than their rhetorical utility.
So I'm glad you informed us that you do have a bias, and you're giving it to the less powerful group. And I'm interested, what does that mean? What's the definition of powerful here? And I think I'll pose my initial question to you is, who is the less powerful group in this circumstance? The trans women or biological females being sexually assaulted by trans women in prisons? Who's the less powerful group here? According to your standard, since there is more harm committed to trans women, they are the less powerful group. So I pose my initial question to you is it okay for trans women to be in female prisons if they are really women? So I think that you need to answer that question, because it looks like in this circumstance, according to your moral standard and according to your dogma and your bias, they are the less powerful group. So I think it's only reasonable for you to answer that question, and that will solve a lot of the issues. You know, with regards to not producing data, and I just make claims about you being biased, and my right-wing authoritarian identity markers. Let's address these points. So I'm a huge fan of critical scholarship. I really am. I've got a book here, which you yourself are familiar with, Joel Marcus, Critical Commentary of Mark. I love it. I love it. And yeah, what's interesting about it is it's considered, the Anchor Bible, that series. It's very confronting for Christian, I guess, Catholicity and orthodoxy and the universal understandings of the deity of Christ and inerrancy in the Bible and all those things. It would be challenging for your everyday Christian to read this, but I greatly appreciate the research because it gives a balanced approach to the data, to orthodox dogmatic claims versus what the data says, and the interpretation, the balance between it. For instance, did Mark really write Mark? One of the things he writes in here, which is really intriguing, is that there's only one really claim by Papias in the 2nd century, I believe, that refers to Peter, Mark being Peter's interpreter, the John Mark, that he refers to, his beloved son. And it seems the way Papias has written it, it seems apologetic. So therefore, apologetic writings often create like the sense that there's a bias there in a dogma. You're defending a position, you're using the argument, this argument to support the fact that you're trying to fight something else. So the idea is that it wouldn't necessarily be true. That's one of the interpretations. There's only one historical source that says that the idea that Mark is Peter's interpreter comes from that, and they analyze that the way that Papias wrote it. I appreciate that. I think that's pretty cool. But then he also says, you know what? It probably is written by a Mark, because Marcus was one of the most common names in the Greco-Roman Empire. And when you're writing in a pseudo-anonymous fashion, you want to invoke apostolic authority. You would use, like maybe Peter or Simon or John or Philip or one of the authoritative names of the Bible that people are familiar with. And the fact that you use Mark, such a generic name, probably was written by a Mark. Is that Mark of John Mark? Anyway, I like that. I find it intriguing. You're not doing that. Out of 101, you introduce yourself as a scholar of religion and the Bible, but you're a critical scholar of Christianity. That would be a better... You're a critical scholar and you're critical of Christianity. I went through 101 videos. Here we go, 101 videos. I titled them and I numbered them from the most recent video when you did it. So the numbers might not match up correctly to the recent videos that you've done, because you've done several recent videos from when I calculated from the top down. But over 101 videos, there's like 93 that are critical of Christianity. There's a few, maybe 4 or 5 promo videos, and one somewhat defending Christian orthodoxy and Catholicity with regards to an atheist claim. So you're heavily critical on Christianity. And you recently did a video about why aren't you critical of Mormon claims, because everyone asks you that. You barely do any videos with regards to atheistic claims against Christianity, Mormon claims against Christianity. There's enormous amount of misinformation promoted by Islam. You have addressed Lily J, a few videos are there, but look at the volume. I think what I'm trying to say, it's better if you start off your videos, I'm a critical scholar of Christian dogmatic claims. That would be fair to introduce yourself as such, because that's what your videos represent. And I just don't have the time at this stage to go through all your videos, but if I have to, I will. But out of 101, 93%, 92% critical of Christianity, that's probably not a balanced approach to critical scholarship. And you are a critical scholar, and the standard for critical scholarship, as displayed by John Marcus in regards to Mark, it's a balanced approach, and I just think you're not doing that. And these right-wing authoritarian identity markers that you keep saying, I'm not right-wing. I don't support Trump. I don't advocate for him as the ideal president. Do I think he's the lesser of two evils in regards to, say, Biden? Sure, I do think that. We can debate that topic one day. Do I think he's a Christian? Well, that's between him and God. You know, I do think that we'll be judged by our fruits, and the fruits are questionable when it comes to Trump. I'm not a huge fan. I need you to know that, because I think I'm a libertarian at heart. You know, I'm a fan of the Austrian school of free market economics. So yeah, centrist, right? You could probably put me in a political category, but I'm not an authoritarian, right-wing, identity, fascist. You know, you really got to get that out of your rhetoric when it comes to me, because that's not who I am. And this idea of digital pats on the back, man, you got to understand. My early videos were having a lot of fun. I did believe, and I was convicted. You helped me shape and take this far more seriously. You know, even with your response videos to Bart Ehrman and things that I said, you know, I've become to appreciate Bart's work. I've come to appreciate your work. Please don't mistake my early videos being, you called them performative, and I think you infer that in this video as well, performative. Let that not come into in such, I guess it would fit within a paradigm by which you judge my faith by that regard. I am convicted. I am here, not here just to perform. I do comedy and things like that, have a bit of fun. You do too. I saw it in those 101 videos. You were actually being a little bit funny. But I'm definitely convicted. Christ has saved me, and I'm here because of the things I've seen. I've seen miraculous things. I've seen amazing things I didn't think possible. I'm here because I believe in Christ, and I advocate for the gospel, that I try as best I can to the gospel that Jesus preached, that the apostles preached. That's what I'm mainly here for. Why I don't believe in Mormonism or Islam or things like that. I think it differs so greatly from what Jesus taught and the apostles taught. But yeah, please don't throw me in that bag, that category, right-wing authoritarian identity markers, and I do it for digital pats on the back. I don't. I really want to stop you misleading Christians by so heavily loading them with critical data without giving them the other side. And you're aware about the other side. You rarely mention it. That's what I'm basically upset about, if anything.
But it's not left-wing identity politics to point out that Ephesians 5 asserts a misogynist perspective. even you acknowledge that today misogyny refers to systemic power asymmetries. Now, you don't use that language, you referred to it in other ways, but you're talking about systems that unilaterally grant more power to men as a result of being a man than to women as a result of being a woman. That is a systemic power asymmetry. That is what misogyny is today. And as we're going to see, there is no case to make that Ephesians 5 does not assert precisely such a systemic power asymmetry.
So, Dan, be careful not to misrepresent me. In the initial part of my video, I made it clear that there's a context within antiquity that misogyny was this hatred of women. That's what it meant. And that doesn't mean that today. Even there's certain Stoic philosophers that somewhat ridiculed the people that had these type of views. Maybe it was an extreme view back then. I haven't done too much research into it. And then I said there's a contemporary understanding of what you said, these hierarchies and power asymmetries with regards to men and women. The fact that I acknowledge that is the current definition within contemporary culture, and that therefore that should substantiate your claim that there is a misogynistic tone or reading in Ephesians 5, that's disingenuous. And I'm going to give you a reason why, because I made it very clear there's an ancient context and then there's a contemporary context. I did not in any way, shape or form say that the writer of Ephesians, the author of Ephesians, held the contemporary view. It's impossible. That view that you hold today with regards to misogynism, that's a contemporary new development in modern culture. It would be anachronistic to apply that to the lens of the author. And I don't think the author was advocating for that. In fact, a hatred of women, a misogynistic overtone, a misogynistic presupposition that the author held, that's not the case with regards to antiquity. If you're reading your current understanding into the text, that's a different ballgame. And it's ironic too, because when I say that the Bible condemns homosexuality, you use the argument that homosexuality, as it is understood today as a sexual identity, was not something that the Bible speaks into because it did not exist in antiquity. But then you also go on to say that the act of penetration, receiving those sexual acts in homosexuality is condemned, which you have my response on that. A bit hard to say that the Bible doesn't condemn homosexuality if it condemns the act of how homosexual couples express physical intimacy. But you just did what you accused me of doing with regards to homosexuality. You can't read your current presuppositions into the text and say that the author of Ephesians was misogynistic when that definition didn't exist back then. Women weren't viewed in the way they were today, back in first century Greco-Roman culture. You're specifically injecting something into the text because you want to read this idea that the author of Ephesians was putting women down. You want to read that into the text that suits your critique of Christianity. These are these biases, that I spoke of previously. And so you're reading these contemporary definitions into an ancient text, eisegesis at the very least. And you're guilty of doing that, knowingly so. You're not letting your audience know that because they see you as this balanced critical scholar, or scholar, mind you, of the Bible and religion, and so that you're only given the facts. No, you're giving dogmatic presuppositions with regards to injecting contemporary definitions into ancient culture so it suits your argument and your overall channel to critique Christianity. That's what you're doing. You're guilty of that.
No, I don't. I have consistently and repeatedly pointed out that we have absolutely no possible option but to negotiate with the text, precisely because texts have no inherent meaning. The question is, what are the rhetorical goals and the priorities and the methods of our negotiation? What I try to do, to the best of my ability, is negotiate a meaning that I believe has the best chance to be closest to what the original authors and audiences understood. What I criticize is negotiations that sideline that concern and prioritize instead utility today, and particularly to the structuring of power and values and boundaries over and against the interests of minoritized, marginalized, and oppressed groups. So my concern is, in that negotiation, are you trying to figure out how it was most meaningful to the authors or audiences, or are you trying to figure out how to make it most meaningful to you today? That's the difference in the negotiations that we have absolutely no possible choice but to engage in. I have never once said I am exempt from that requirement.
So I think I've demonstrated that you were bringing your dogmatic stances into the text by anachronistically injecting misogynistic overtones and attributing them to the author when they didn't think of that in that way. In fact, I think to be misogynistic back then was to hate women, and so I don't think the author hates women at all. This suits your overall channel and your critique of Christianity and the work that you do, and so I think you're not saying that you're exempt from that, but you're just not making it clear that you want to critique Christianity, not give the balanced data. And so, with regards to analysing a text in its ancient culture and analysing the text and how it's applicable today, I try to do that. I always want to represent the author within its ancient context and show how it is applicable today without misrepresenting them. But we'll see what the audience thinks.
And from Inspiring Philosophy has done that. He's blocked him, and yet he still reviews Michael's videos.
The perennial butthurt among apologists about my having blocked Mike Jones just never ceases to amaze me. But I have...
So this section, I just wanted to include when I talk about Michael Jones, Dan spends a significant portion on Michael Jones. I've sent the video to Michael Jones. I can leave it for him to respond to. There's a lot of data here that I wasn't aware of, and I think I should make comment on this until I hear Michael Jones' side. So I'm going to skip this section, Dan, not to leave out any of your arguments or the retort that you made to my claims. When people disagree with you, you block them, and I'll address all that once I see Michael's side and version of events, okay? Not me trying to misrepresent you at all. You very may well be correct in this circumstance and justified in blocking Michael if it's true what you say. But if you do want to go into this, again, the link to Dan's video in the description below.
In verse 21 in the household code in Ephesians 5, it says that straight away everyone has to submit to each other out of reverence to Christ.
So I want you to note real quick, because we're going to come back to it, that this content creator is suggesting that verse 21 says everyone has to submit to one another. Everyone has to submit to one another. This is actually not what this text is saying, because this is not a great translation. And it's not a great translation because what's going on in the Greek syntactically doesn't translate very well into English. But we're going to come back to this. Remember, according to this content creator, Ephesians 5:21 says everyone has to submit to one another.
Okay, so Dan, I did misspeak there. Remember, I don't plan these videos out as carefully as what you do, hence why I want to give you the courtesy of doing this video as clearly as I can right now. I misspoke. I think I made it clear in the Greek that it's voluntary submission, and the Greek does indicate that in that video, which is similar to wives submitting to their husbands. So, I mean, you could be somewhat charitable with me. I think you were, ultimately. because you know that the Greek differs from that of, and especially the Greek words with regards to obedience of slaves and obedience of children. With regards to submission, wives submitting to their husbands, it is a voluntary act, and it's also a voluntary act to submit to one another in reverence for Christ.
So, he just said everyone has to submit to each other, and now he's saying, no, you don't have to. This is voluntary because this is the middle passive voice. And it is, because it's not the main verb of the sentence. The main verb of the sentence is actually be filled by the Spirit. And then you have a bunch of clauses governed by participles. And these participles can be understood either as what facilitates being filled by the Spirit or what results from being filled by the Spirit. But the imperative comes in verse 18, be filled by the Spirit. And then it says singing hymns and psalms and praising, submitting to each other. So this submission is either what facilitates the imperative be filled by the Spirit, or what results from the imperative be filled by the Spirit. And the participle only occurs in verse 21. Verse 22 is pivoting from a more general scope to a more specific scope that is focused on the household and what are known as household codes. But it is the participle in verse 21 that is the pivot point. And so verse 22 really in the Greek only says, wives to your husbands, assuming the verbal force of the participle that was in verse 21. And so that participle cannot have an imperative force. But because it is subordinate to the finite verb in verse 18, which is an imperative, a passive imperative, it borrows that force. You either are going to do this because of this imperative, what I told you to do, or you're going to do this in order to facilitate what I told you to do in the imperative. Now, this is kind of squishy. This is kind of complex grammar. But people who try to make a big deal out of the fact that this participle, which cannot have an imperative force, doesn't have an imperative force, are really out over their skis and trying to contrast this participle to the imperative finite verbs that are going to come up later on in Ephesians 5 when it talks about children obeying and enslaved folks obeying, is making a bigger deal out of what really is just a syntactical incident. So, is Ephesians 5 telling wives that they should be submitting to their husbands? Yes. Does it mean much to say that it's in the middle passive and therefore it is their voluntary submission that is being demanded? Not really. It's still telling women they need to submit to their husbands because their husbands are the head of them. And no matter how squishy you try to make that, and no matter how much you try to say, no, it's an invitation to do this voluntarily, it's still asserting a systemic power asymmetry. The husband is the head of the wife. The wife submits to the husband. No matter how much you try to suggest that the demand on the husbands are also difficult, that the demands on the husband to love the wife as Christ loved the church is an impossibly high standard to meet, no matter how much you try to argue that that's putting a heavy impetus on the husband as well, none of that changes the fact that there is very clearly a systemic power asymmetry. The husband has power over the wife that the wife does not exercise over the husband. That is prejudicial treatment. That is saying you have less power simply in virtue of being a woman. That is misogyny.
So there's a lot there, and I'm going to try and remember as much as I can, even though I'm doing this in this, taking it step by step, and doing this in segments. I still try and have to remember all the points. I want to give you a sincere response without trying to do it on a teleprompter. So if I miss anything, Dan, I apologize. So what Dan is saying about the Greek, if you didn't miss it, he's saying that the verse, just to paraphrase, that submitting to each other out of reverence to Christ really belongs to the preceding paragraph. And you know what? He makes a good case, and that's why the ESV says that he actually, the ESV puts it towards the regarding of the feeling of the Spirit. NIV does not put it that way. These translation committees, they're phenomenal depending on their methodologies, word for word, meaning for meaning. They can make their arguments for and against. I like the NIV because I think it accurately represents the idea that if you are filled with the Spirit and you're submitting to one another voluntarily, it would be an accurate representation of the fruit of the Spirit, especially invoking apostolic Pauline authority. Now, here's the interesting part. None of that, whether it belongs to the preceding paragraph or not, I still think it suits the point, the idea that it's a voluntary submission, even us voluntarily coming before God. And I think my initial point that it's anachronistic to inject a contemporary definition and attribute that to the author that did not think that way. In fact, I see that the ancient context that it was written in was very liberating for women because, as in my previous video, these women already had to submit to their husbands involuntarily. That if they did not submit to their husbands, they could be killed for it. There's further information of this of another scholar that I mentioned, Dr. Adam White. We did a podcast together, and it was very normal for Greco-Roman women to submit to their husbands. They were expected to, while the man had to go and, was basically go fornicate anything that moved. And I mentioned this in the video, that if the author of Ephesians is not Paul, he's still invoking Pauline authority. And we see that the writings in Corinthians, which were written well before Ephesians, says that a woman had to be a slave to a man, like her body is owned by the man, but the woman also owns the man's body like a slave. And so she has authority over that. And they had to submit each other out of reverence to Christ. This is what is expected of them. And so this was revolutionary and liberating for women that gave them sexual equality when a man could do whatever he wanted. He could no longer do that. The idea of a woman owning a man's body is otherworldly. It's revolutionary in terms of the contemporary thinking within antiquity. So this gave women a stepping stone to have equality with their partners. And the idea that the men being the head of the house it's somewhat representative of the Godhead and the monarchy within the Trinity, that even though we see Jesus humble himself and submit to the will of the Father, that does not mean he is lesser in nature. That the distinction in roles is not a distinction in nature. And I think that the idea of a husband loving his wife self-sacrificially as Christ loved for the church, the woman's not called to do that. I mentioned that in the later videos, that this type of love that is displayed would be countercultural in that time with regards to how to treat your wife, less as property but more as your one flesh. I think this to attribute the author as a misogynist is just so far-reaching. I mean, that's my point. Whether you believe that submitting to one another, the reverence of Christ, belongs with the preceding paragraph or not, I think it doesn't really negate the point that the fact that this was very liberating for women to hear these words spoken.
But ultimately irrelevant, because it does not challenge the systemic power asymmetry that is asserted. It's just saying, men, you are in a position of higher authority, so you have a lot more responsibility. It's not about saying this means men have no responsibility and they can do whatever they want. It's about pointing out no matter how much responsibility the man is supposed to have, they still have authority over their wives, and the wives do not have comparable authority over them. It is not about mutual submission here. The mutual submission is just one church member to another. It's a more general, congregation-wide, church body-wide mutual submission. When we focus in on the household, the submission only goes one way.
So I would disagree. I think that invoking Pauline authority, and people would be familiar with Paul's scriptures and writings, knowing that Ephesians was written much later, understanding the Pauline ethic and principles teaching within a Christian paradigm, that a woman could own a man's body just like a man could own a woman's body. And the general submission to each other out of reverence for Christ is still towards the church. It encompasses men and women, where women were women made up a larger portion of the church, especially in Corinth, in the early church, as opposed to men, because this they weren't allowed to learn. This was like a school. Men were the ones that were taught, so they were invited to learn. Women were invited to learn new countercultural things that gave them sexual equality and ontological equality with their husbands. I mean, wow. Yeah, I just totally disagree with you, and don't think the author was being misogynistic at all.
So, two things here. Ephesians, likely not written by Paul, pointing out that the author is trying to leverage Paul's authority does not mean that we must therefore lash that author's ideologies to Paul and say whatever Paul said, we must imagine that this author agreed with, because that is flatly undermined by the more rank misogyny of the author of the pastoral epistles and whoever likely interpolated 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35, where women are denied the right to even speak or ask their husbands a question during church services, which...
Dan, you're really... what you're doing there is you just admitted that it's an interpolation, which I don't necessarily agree with. But if it is an interpolation, it's not representative of what Paul thinks. That's your position, and yet you're using that as an argument to poison the ideas of the author of Ephesians and my argument in invoking Pauline authority. That's that you're pushing the limits of what's fair there. Now, if you did say it's not an interpolation, why did you, you can bring up that point, but you said it is an interpolation, and for those that don't understand what that means, it's another author injecting that into the text. So the fact that you're using it, let me counter, again, you've got to watch this podcast with a scholar, Dr. Adam White, but the idea of women not speaking and then Paul encouraging them to prophesy, it's contradictory. And I think within the context of orderly worship, women were asking too many questions and disrupting the service. It's not about them not being able to speak. But then you just admitted that you thought it was interpolation. So that's not representative of Paul, which is then not representative of his overall theology and ethic that the author of Ephesians is invoking. I don't even know why you did that. That's not kind.
Directly contradicts Paul's instructions about when women are prophesying and praying in church. So if you want to talk about Paul, talk about Paul. But trying to insist that Paul's sexual ethics govern how we interpret the sexual ethics of pseudo-Pauline authors is highly problematic. But at the same time, is it revolutionary to say, yes, the body of the husband belongs to the wife? To some degree, does it overcome misogyny? Not remotely.
Dan, I mean, you just agreed, somewhat agreed that it's revolutionary. It is so countercultural, that idea of a woman owning a man's body like a slave. Name one piece of literature in antiquity that actually advocates for that. You won't be able to find it. It is revolutionary. You just need to admit that. It's amazing and it's wonderful. And it's a very positive thing for women in antiquity and laid the foundations for women's rights today. And sure, the Bible's been used for bad things against women, sure. But in this particular case, back within its ancient context, it's very liberating for them. It's fantastic. And I think the idea of this misogyny and overcoming it, again, I don't think the author was misogynistic because he didn't think, I don't think he hated women, and I don't think he thought of power asymmetries of men the way you're defining it in a contemporary context. If anything, he's doing the opposite of that. He is giving them equality, ontological equality and sexual equality with their husbands. And the distinction as roles is not the hierarchy or that you would assume in terms of nature.
Because there are still power asymmetries, systemic and other kinds, that exist in this relationship. So it's a false equivalence. Because you might as well also say that, well, just like the husband has the ability to beat his wife, the wife has the ability to beat her husband too, so it's all things are equal. Does that really mean all things are equal? Or is that just giving an excuse to one partner to abuse the other? Which is what 1 Corinthians 7 has been historically leveraged to excuse. Marital rape, which overwhelmingly victimizes women in marriages, has been justified and excused for a long, long time by appeal to 1 Corinthians 7. In fact, it's only a few decades ago that marital rape was criminalized in a lot of places in the United States. So to point out that a parity is asserted does not mean parity is actually achieved, because of the differences in the two sides of this binary. Just telling women, oh, you have a right over your husband's body, does not suddenly make the abuses that so commonly result from the view that a husband has a right over his wife's body go away. It just gives you authorization for that, but excuses it on the grounds, well, that she gets to do the same thing to me, as if that's really going to change things. So I would agree that Paul is taking a step forward. Paul is not overcoming the misogyny. Paul is not making the misogyny go away. And again, I don't think it's Paul speaking in Ephesians, and you can't just argue that we must import all of Paul's ideologies when the pseudo-Pauline literature frequently so directly contradicts what is in the genuine Pauline epistles.
I mean, there's so much there in that. And you're just going so off topic, Dan. How Scripture is used today, or it's used in the last 500 years, is going to be inconsequential to the argument that we're having now as to the intent of the author. So I think you're somewhat poisoning the well here with regards to the arguments being made as to what's representative of what the author thought. And people misuse Scripture all the time, as I mentioned. But let's get focused on the argument at hand. The idea that the author is providing something so countercultural, the idea that the author is providing as I mentioned, an ontological and a sexual equality with that of a partner, was just not done within Greco-Roman period, and I think would be positive towards women, and an opportunity to learn this new ethic that they would not learn anywhere else, even being invited to learn, as I mentioned before. And I think it's the antithesis of misogyny. I think it's lifting women up. So we differ on that point, and a lot of this stuff that you mention, it's inconsequential to the argument that we're having at hand.
So we're kind of massaging together 1 Corinthians 7 and Ephesians 5 again. Ephesians 5 never tells any husband that he must submit to his wife. It only tells wives they must submit to their husbands. It says that the husband is the head of the wife. Now, as much as Paul may have taken baby steps toward greater egalitarianism when it came to the role of women in Christian communities, Paul does not overcome the patriarchy of the Greco-Roman world. Paul reaffirms most of the patriarchal standards of the Greco-Roman world. The household code, whether it's regarding husbands and wives or children or enslaved folks, reaffirms the majority of the Greco-Roman social conventions and standards and mores and ideals. Yes, it does make improvements. No, it does not make the misogyny go away.
So, you're admitting that it does make improvements. It doesn't make the misogyny go away. But if you were to concede the fact that the author never thought misogyny in terms of what you thought misogyny is, that if the author had the contemporary understanding that there was misogyny was hating women, then improving the standards of which how women were treated, this ends the argument. So I think we will come down to whether or not you will concede my understanding that it's anachronistic of you to inject your contemporary definition and attributed that to the author when he just didn't think of terms in terms of that way. He may have been very, if you're going to, you might have to create a different word for what you're talking about. I think this idea, I'm massaging the two scriptures together. I think it's quite clear that if it's not written by Paul, and you're pseudo-anonymously trying to invoke Pauline authority, which he clearly is at the start, and it's written much later, you'd have to be consistent as best you can with regards to what Paul taught if you're going to invoke Paul's name. Hence why I'm using it. Hence why think there's a reasonable argument there to be consistent, because it would stand out so wildly and contradictory. And the fact that it was read in early worship services in the early church and attributed to Paul, it's not as concrete as you would think that it's not Paul. But even the fact that there's consistency in the early worship services and the early canons of the church that it was attributed to Paul, people, at least within the 200 years that it been written, did not think it was so contradictory that you're framing it to be. So it'd be interesting to see how you would define misogyny now based on what I'm proffering.
Yes, except it was Romans, not Ephesians, that Phoebe is mentioned and that Phoebe carries. But we can, again, look at the pastoral epistles, the interpolation in 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35, where women are denied the right to have any authority. They're even denied the ability to lean over and ask their husbands a question during the service. You cannot say, oh, we're appealing to Pauline authority. That means everything that Paul said overrules anything that might seem to contradict that authority.
Dan, again, you're correct on this. I'm aware that it was Romans. Just misspoke, but yep, happy to concede that. Thanks for the correction. I think this point is moot, Dan, because you admitted it's interpolation, so therefore it's not attributed to Paul. So you shouldn't bring it up as an argument to support it. But if you're going to use it again, I'll use the same argument again. You're totally misrepresenting the idea that women were speaking just too much, asking too many questions. There's a lot of women in the service disrupting the service. That's what Paul's speaking into. Clearly, because prior he's encouraging them to prophesy. So you're just misrepresenting the text to suit your critique.
The author of Ephesians is not subject to everything that Paul said. They are trying to arrogate the authority to their own perspectives, which are going to be different from Paul's perspectives, as we see again quite conspicuously in the pastoral epistles and in the interpolation in 1 Corinthians 14, 34, and 35.
Look, even if we were to separate them two, I still think that the idea that voluntary submission to a husband out of reverence for Christ, and the husband loving his wife, it's still very encouraging for women and lifts them up and doesn't put them down the way you're framing it. Even if we attributed that, just the idea of voluntary submission to the husband when they had to do it, Greco-Roman women in antiquity, that was a normal. You had to submit. In this case, it's voluntary submission, which I've already indicated in the Greek grammar. It indicates that. So just Ephesians on itself, I wouldn't say it's, if we would leave Corinthians out of it and leave Pauline authorship out of it or authority out of it, just attributed to the author of Ephesians, I still think it's liberating for women, not misogynistic.
Well, not according to Paul, who would rather people just didn't get married and lived celibate lives. And according to Paul, you really only needed to get married if you weren't already married, if you just couldn't hack celibacy.
See, this is what I mean when it comes to you and your unbalanced views. You're fully aware that one of the reasons why Paul advocated for that ethic is he did think the end of the world was coming within a generation. Thought the day of the Lord would be here. And you see his eschatological views change as time goes on. You know that's one of the reasons why he advocated for that sexual ethic. And so you're deceptively leaving that out, that caveat, to suit your argument. Because if he did think that, then the world wasn't going to be ending. Then let's take Paul's complete writings together and see how one is to negotiate the text with that understanding. That's your view. I've heard you say that he thought the world was ending. That's why he did that. If I've misremembered that and not articulate that correctly, please let me know. But if that's true, then you're selectively leaving that out and look somewhat deceptive in order to try and discredit the argument. So I think that's not charitable towards the text again.
So the notion that Paul sees the full expression of bearing God's image as achieved only within marriage is false. Now, again, Ephesians probably wasn't written by Paul. It was probably written later on when they already were trying to account for the delayed parousia. So the author of Ephesians might see...
There you go. You see what I'm talking about? He mentions it in relation to the Ephesians, but not Paul. So, the delayed parousia or the delayed second coming of Jesus.
This image bearer idea as fully achieved within marriage, but that's not really clear from the text. Irrespective, however, Ephesians 5 still quite clearly says that man is the head of his wife and that wives submit to their husbands, which again is a systemic power asymmetry, is misogyny.
I think Paul, being an expert on Torah, would be familiar with Genesis. I think understanding Jesus' view on marriage, one flesh, Genesis 2:24, serious thing, serious enough for the apostles to go, oof, best off not getting married. We don't want to ever break the law in divorcing our wives. So I was using the idea of an image bearer to say that there seems to be an understanding within Scripture that I think Paul, maybe somewhat of an assertion here, but I would just say that he's an expert of Torah. He knows the historical Jesus' teachings, and he's interpreting them within a Gentile audience. And with that said, the full expression of an image bearer of God is man and wife as one flesh. I don't think that's an unreasonable leap. And the fact that he advocated for that sexual ethic, just as you mentioned, was because he thought the world was going to end soon. So I think my point still stands, that the Bible does advocate for something that is a brand new idea within its ancient Near Eastern context, that the image bearer of God is for all people, believer or unbeliever, not just for the elites, the priests and the kings. That's something that brings an ontological equality with one another, both regardless of race, creed, or gender. And I think that's a great thing within the Bible. And I think Paul's advocates for that, and he's, as I mentioned before, that sexual ethic, I think doesn't disprove that point.
So you've yet to identify any presuppositions or any biases. You started with a red herring about trans ideology, and then you started by misrepresenting me as having blocked Mike Jones because he pointed out that I also negotiate with the text, which is something I have repeatedly and consistently pointed out. Neither I nor anyone else has any other option but to do. Then you went on to apparently identify systemic power asymmetries based on sex as misogyny, but said it shouldn't count really in Ephesians 5 because, one, at least the author was making some progress over the existing social conventions, and two, another author altogether also made progress over existing social conventions. None of that is, one, directly addressing my original point, which was that there was prejudicial treatment based on sex, which constitutes misogyny, with which you seem to agree. None of this identifies any presuppositions or biases, and none of it addresses my very clear point, which you don't seem to be able to disagree with, that there is the assertion of a systemic power asymmetry, and that is misogyny. You haven't directly addressed that yet.
So firstly, the biases, I think I've made it clear that you're critical, you're hypercritical of Christianity at the expense of alternative data that is readily available for everyone, and you present yourself as a scholar of religion and the Bible, and I think you heavily lean one particular side in being critical of Christianity, and I think this video is a classic example of your biases made evident with regards to your stance on left-wing ideologies, whether it be trans, same-sex marriage, saying that the author of Ephesians is misogynistic within a contemporary definition. I think I've demonstrated in this video thus far that the author would not think of have the misogynistic overtones that you declare him to have, and it is the antithesis of what you argue for with homosexuality. That I can't say homosexuality is condemned in the Bible because homosexuality as it is understood today was not, as a sexual identity, it was not spoken into or aware of within first century Greco-Roman culture. So the fact that you're now switching the hermeneutic there, the methodology of which you understand the text, to suit your biases, therein lies the victim of left-wing identity politics. I think you're unaware that you're doing it. That's why I call you a victim. I think you've bought into this ideology like you're helping people, and I think you do want to help people. You do want to help the less powerful. I get that. Just don't think that you have within secular humanism an objective moral compass to do so. So you fall victim to what is perceived to be the data and what's harmful and what's the good consequences and the bad consequences when there's no objective basis within secular humanism or utilitarian ethical model to say that morality is grounded in objectivity. It's just merely relative. So why not just do what we want to do? So that's the issue. I think that would get exposed if you did do it a debate with someone. You would be able to see it in real time. So I don't think the author is being misogynistic at all.
No, I don't just throw out what you say. I try to directly engage everything that you say, and I try to do so in good faith. Now,
I have a video here where you disregarded what I said. Have a look. Which happens after the millennial reign with the coming of the clouds of heaven in Matthew 24, which is surprising.
So here you are just asserting the reinterpretation that you prefer, which is precisely what Bart pointed out Christians are compelled to do in order to make sense of this passage, and it is precisely what I said you were going to.
So that's why I mentioned it. You don't always treat me with such respect. You've never given me 51 minutes to respond to every point before, and just in that video, it's evidence of that not being the case. That's why I brought it up. You probably forgot about it. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. I genuinely think you mean well, but yeah, you haven't given me the time to address all my points before. This is the first time really that you're doing it in such detail.
the fact that I am usually critical of what you say is based on the fact that I don't think that the evidence you bring to the table is adequate to support the conclusions you assert, but that doesn't mean I am not fairly and in good faith engaging everything that you are saying.
Fair point. But again, you haven't given me this type of time before. And yeah, no, I appreciate your response on this. And I think I've just differed on what you've said and the data that I don't agree with the data that you've presented here. Hopefully I've demonstrated that effectively. And if you have the time to go through all this, that would be interesting to see what happens. That's why I encourage us to have a discussion. I think it would be great for us to sit down. I'm happy to fly over. I'm happy to fly you over to Australia. How about I fly you over to Australia, we sit down at a studio. I'm sure I could learn so much from you. We can go fishing. We can even go spearfishing, right? Take you to the Great Barrier Reef. You'll love it. That's why this is a very, I think, an unproductive way to go through this text. But no, I appreciate you giving the time of day in this. I disagree. I'd like to see what you think afterwards.
I think I've engaged fully your argument here, but if I have left anything on the table, by all means, tell me the timestamp. Where should I go to find the argument that you made that I didn't address, or the evidence that you brought up that I ignored?
No, you didn't. You addressed every point. You addressed every point, so all good.
No, I am not trying to harm the Bible or anybody who believes in the Bible. I'm trying to represent what the data indicate about what's going on in these texts. And I'm doing my best to represent the majority position of the scholars who are publishing on these issues today. And I believe I am fairly representing the perspectives of these scholars. But if you know better, by all means, point out where I have misrepresented somebody or I have misrepresented the current state of the field. I also believe that I have quite fairly and quite directly engaged the concerns that you've expressed in this video. But again, if I have missed something or if I have misrepresented you, point it out and we can discuss this further.
I think I've illustrated here. I mean, this is a long video for now. I've illustrated here that in my previous points where I think you've misrepresented me. So I'll see what you say about that.
Except you haven't even been able to identify, much less demonstrate, any particular dogma that has motivated what I said in that video. You seem to agree that the word misogyny refers to systemic power asymmetries. Nothing in this video actually undermines the conclusion that Ephesians 5:22 is asserting a systemic power asymmetry. And this pathetic appeal to transphobic rhetoric is utterly irrelevant. It is another demonstration that you're not actually engaging me seriously. You're just performing for an audience that you know will eat up these right-wing authoritarian identity markers and give you those little digital pats on the butt that you're really after.
Man, Dan, you don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know what I've seen. You think this is all a performance. It's not the case. I could understand why you say that because of the previous interactions that we've had, but never anything like this. And I'm not transphobic. I really care about women's rights. I've got 2 daughters. I care about the culture that they're growing up in. I care about what's happening with the confusion of young children being taught this ideology. And, it's been abused. And I think unnecessarily so when there's genuine kids suffering from gender dysphoria. And they should be treated, they should be loved, they should be taken care of. It should not be normalized because it's not normal. It's a very dangerous ideology, very confusing. I don't do this to appeal to right-wing identity markers within my audience that will lap it up and pat me on the butt. No, that's not what this is about. This is about truth. This is about truth.
And as I've repeatedly addressed in dozens of videos, that was in spite of the Bible, not because of the Bible.
Without opening up a new can of worms and making this whole video even longer, there's plenty of videos about the Christian abolitionists banning slavery because of the Bible, the teachings that are in there. So we'll leave that for another day.
I frequently give credit to Christianity and criticize accusations that I don't think are supported by the data. For instance, we're coming up on Halloween and Christmas, and there are going to be all kinds of accusations about where that came from. And I'm going to, as I have done every time these things come up toward the end of the year, point out that these are not influenced by pagan sources, that these are things that Christians came up with. I do this kind of thing all the time. I am doing my best to try to present what the data indicate. That's all. But the fact that you had to end with this little "don't be so mean to Christians" swipe, I think makes clear that really this is just about your own hurt feelings and that you cannot engage dispassionately with the data if doing so means criticizing the Bible or criticizing Christians. And you need to do better about that.
I can see where you're coming from. There's probably some times where passion comes out, especially in the past, which I'll apologize for. As time goes on, the more I study, the more I learn. I'm learning to be dispassionate about certain points. And I said before, I appreciate critical scholarship. I don't think, doing Halloween and Christmas and all the pagan myth stuff, I think that's somewhat of a scapegoat in terms of the point that I made. Because you're fully aware of the amount of misinformation when it comes from Islam. And I've just indicated before that the 101 reels that you did, 93% are critical of Christian claims. Address the other points too. For someone that is somewhat governed by a utilitarian ethical model, the volume by which you criticize Christian claims versus other worldviews demonstrates an unnecessary bias. And we can get into the motivations later. But yeah, how about you do better too? You do better. There's so much misinformation that atheists and New Age people and Muslims, Mormons, what they make about Christianity. How about start balancing your videos in that regard? You do better with addressing those claims as well. I'll try and do better too. And the invitation's open. Come to Australia. Let's meet. Let's negotiate the text together and really dig into it. And I've enjoyed this. And the fit for this video is just a yellow shirt. I'm only joking. All right. God bless you. And look forward to hearing the response if it does happen.